Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor. I'm Pastor Joshua Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas. And real quick, before we get to today's question, if you have something you'd like to ask the pastor, you can email me, atpholycross, all one word, at gmail.com, and I'll get to your question as soon as I'm able. Also, while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell so you don't miss upcoming episodes, and give the video a thumbs up if you think it deserves one, and share it on social media as well. All right, with that said, let's get to today's question. Hello and greetings of God's peace from Finland. All right, what should Lutherans think of John Chrysostom, greatly respected church father in the Orthodox Church? Is he a good teacher, or should we ignore him? Well, Lutherans, really simply put, they think the same thing about John Chrysostom as we do all the church fathers. He is a witness to the Scripture insofar as his teaching, insofar as he teaches according to Scripture. But in those places where he deviates from Scripture, then we cannot follow his opinion. And if you followed Ask the Pastor for any length of time, you know that I like Chrysostom. You also know that I'm not afraid to leave him on the wayside when he speaks contrary to Scripture. And this is precisely how he himself then did theology. He said in his 13th homily on 2 Corinthians, "Wherefore I exhort and entreat you all, disregard what this man and that man thinks about these things, and inquire from the Scriptures in all these things." So like so many of the other church fathers, Chrysostom, wanted Scripture to be the judge and the umpire of what is believed. Now, the Lutheran confessions, they cite Chrysostom favorably on multiple occasions. The Augsburg Confession cites him as a witness to public rather than private masses in the early church. That's in Article 24, paragraph 34. It also cites him as a witness against the enumeration of all sins in private confession. That would be Article 26, paragraph 11. Melanchthon cites Chrysostom's witness in the treatise on the power and primacy of the Pope, paragraph 28, that the rock upon which Christ built his church is not Peter himself, but as Chrysostom says, the faith of his confession. Now, the Formula of Concord as well. In Article 8, paragraph 15, it identifies Chrysostom as one of the chief ancient teachers of the church, along with Cyprian, Leo I, Gregory, Ambrose, and Augustine, who testify to the Scripture's teaching that in the Lord's Supper, we receive not only Christ's body and blood spiritually by faith, but orally as well on account of the sacramental union. Now, elsewhere, Chrysostom is cited as a witness to the fact that the words that Christ spoke when he instituted the Lord's Supper, that those words retain their validity and their efficacy today. It says, as Chrysostom says in his sermon concerning the Passion, Christ himself prepared this table and blesses it. For no man makes the bread and wine set before us, the body and blood of Christ, but Christ himself who was crucified for us. That's in Article 7, paragraph 76. And then the Catalogue of Testimonies as well, an appendix to the Book of Concord. It cites Chrysostom several times as a testimony to the doctrine that the divine nature shares its divine power and majesty with the human nature of Christ. So all this is to say that Lutherans have a very high view of John Chrysostom when he's speaking the same thing as Holy Scripture. Now, there are certain topics in which Chrysostom strays from Scripture. One of those areas is prayers for the dead. Another is original sin. In fact, the Pelagians tried to make Chrysostom into their ally because of his rather careless way of speaking about original sin and free will. This led Augustine, in Book 1 of his work against Julian, to use Chrysostom's own words to show how he taught in accord with Scripture on original sin. Namely that Adam's sin condemned the entire human race, all in common, and then the effects of the original sin, what effects it had upon our nature. Now, Chrysostom's words about the freedom of the will, they can also be very troubling. He doesn't speak clearly on the topic, and he often comes across as a synergist. In fact, Philip Melanchthon often cited John's axiom, God draws, but he draws the willing, as an example of a sentiment that's contrary to Scripture. And the Formula of Concord even cites those words of Chrysostom and confesses that it is not in harmony with the form of sound doctrine, but contrary to it. And therefore, when we speak of conversion to God, it should be avoided. That's in Solid Declaration, Article 2, paragraph 86. So Chrysostom says something similar then when he's explaining Romans 9:16. He says, all indeed depends upon God, but not so that our free will is hindered. If then it depend on God, one says, why does he blame us? And on this account I said, so that our free will is not hindered. It depends then on us and on him, for we must first choose the good, and then he leads us to his own. He does not anticipate our choice, lest our free will should be outraged. But when we have chosen, then great is the assistance he brings to us. For it is ours to choose and to wish, but God's to complete and to bring to an end. Since therefore the greater part is of him, he says all is of him, speaking according to the custom of men. So these words are an example of the fact that before the Pelagian controversy, the ancients were accustomed to speaking more loosely when it came to the role of human will in conversion. Now, here's another example that Martin Chemnitz cites from Chrysostom's 52nd homily in Genesis. Just as we can never do anything right unless we are helped, so unless we contribute what is ours to give, we cannot receive favor from above. So again, whenever Chrysostom speaks like this, we can't follow him because that opinion departs from Holy Scripture. Now, there are other times when he's speaking of the freedom of the will, the role of the will, not necessarily in conversion, but while cooperating with God in the pursuit of virtue, meaning post-conversion. But he still speaks in an ambiguous way. Consider these words here from a sermon on Philippians 2:12-13. He writes, I said it not with this in view, that thou shouldest give up in despair, that thou shouldest suppose virtue to be somewhat difficult to be attained, but that thou mightest be led to follow after it, and not spend thyself in vain pursuits. If this be the case, God will work all things. If thou wilt, in that case he will work in thee to will. Be not affrighted, thou art not worsted, both the hearty desire and the accomplishment are a gift from him. For where we have the will, thenceforward he will increase our will. For instance, I desire to do some good work. He has wrought the good work itself, and by means of it he has wrought also the will. Or he says this in an excess of piety, as when he declares that our well-doings are gifts of grace. So Chrysostom, when speaking about human responsibility and free will like this, his ultimate goal seems to be to combat spiritual laxity in his hearers. But in speaking like this, he ends up attributing more to the unregenerate will than the Scripture does. And in these and other places, when he speaks in this way, we don't follow him, since he does not follow the Scripture, or because he's not being as clear as he should have been. Now, despite the many unfortunate things that he said about man's abilities in conversion, Chrysostom spoke well when it came to speaking about God's grace and faith. Homily 17 on Romans, there he says, this he calls God's righteousness, that from faith, because it comes entirely from the grace from above, and because men are justified in this case, not by labors, but by the gift of God. And he speaks clearly there on the gift of justification and how it's received by faith alone. And he says in a homily on Galatians 3, they said that he who adhered to faith alone was cursed. But he, Paul, shows that he who adhered to faith alone is blessed. And elsewhere he says, he is not only saved, but is even justified and led them to boasting. And this too without needing works, but looking for faith only. And lest anyone think that Chrysostom thought faith was the work of man, he says in his 30th homily on Acts, let us think nothing on our own, seeing even faith itself is not our own, but more God's than ours. So far from ignoring Chrysostom, Lutherans treat him as they treat any father in the church. We accept what he has written insofar as he agrees with the God-given scriptures. Martin Chemnitz, again, summarizes this position really well when he says, we love and praise the testimonies of the fathers which agree with Scripture. I hope this helps, and as you read John Chrysostom, I hope this helps you read him with a little bit more clarity and understanding as well. We'll see you next time for another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor.